This is the final part of our lecture on the cerebral cortex. In this fifth part, we will be focusing on the medial aspect of the temporal lobe, as well as a couple of cortical areas that are going to be deep and cannot be seen from a surface view of the brain. The medial portion of the temporal lobe, as well as the temporal pole. The temporal pole would be like the anterior tip of the temporal lobe, are all important parts of our limbic system, our affective or emotional system. Within the medial aspect of the temporal lobe, we have the primary olfactory cortex, and then two subcortical structures that I want to talk about, the hippocampus and the amygdala. The limbic system includes the primary olfactory cortex, the hippocampus, and the amygdala. The cingulate gyrus, which is a deeper area I will be talking about later in this lecture, that sits just superior to the corpus callosum. And the limbic areas of the frontal lobe. So this would be the ventral prefrontal cortex and the orbital frontal cortex within it. You can think of the limbic system as being involved with fighting, feeding, fleeing, and fornication. The primary olfactory cortex is where we have perception of smell. The only sensation that we have that does not pass through the thalamus before going to the cortex is the sense of smell. When that smell gets to the olfactory bulb and travels down the axons in the olfactory tract, it makes its way to the primary olfactory cortex, but does not go back to the thalamus before doing so. A lesion of the primary olfactory cortex results in anosmia. Irritation of this area, which is most commonly due to tumors, results in olfactory hallucinations. And for some unknown reason, these hallucinations are always of very bad smells. Here, the blue oval is giving an idea of the area of the primary olfactory cortex. A subcortical structure within the temporal lobe is the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a long structure traveling quite a distance in the temporal lobe, and it is somewhat spiral shaped, similar to the tail of a seahorse, which is why it got its name. It's positioned so that it's at the floor of the lateral ventricle. It is usually larger in women than in men, although we do not know a functional implication of this. It has a lot of reciprocal connections with the frontal lobe, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the amygdala. The hippocampus is a key structure for the consolidation of memories, the type of memories that are conscious, personal, and contextual. Memories for things like motor skills that you do automatically really don't go through the hippocampus. But for those memories where you can put words and definitions, and you can describe exactly what happened and what you're doing, etc. These conscious, contextual types of memories need to go to the hippocampus to be consolidated. And in our last lecture of the unit, we will talk about what consolidation means. But basically, you cannot form long-term memories if you do not consolidate those memories first. The hippocampus is really important with its links to the amygdala, with linking emotions to memories, so that you remember that one particular birthday party and it makes you excited and happy. Those emotions linked to that memory are due to connections between the hippocampus and the amygdala. The hippocampus is capable of undergoing mitosis throughout our lifetime. Other than really the olfactory nerve, this is the only place within the CNS where we can undergo mitosis. it allows us to have new learning throughout our lives. And we will see that its size increases with challenging tasks. So your hippocampus is probably much larger with this course than it was prior to this course. Keeping in mind this is a subcortical structure, so it's not on the surface. I have drawn here a spiral representing, again, think about a seahorse's tail as it's wrapped around a branch. That's what this kind of looks like when you take a look inside the hippocampus. And it's long, extending through much of the temporal lobe. The hippocampus will shrink, however, and there'll be a reduction in neurogenesis when you have chronic stress. So the short-term stress of something like this course is not going to cause you to shrink your hippocampus. The challenge will actually help to increase its size. But if you have a chronic stress or chronic depressive state, this will cause the hippocampus to shrink. Also, it is known to get smaller and shrink and to have reduced neurogenesis when taking chemotherapy drugs. And many people taking chemotherapy drugs will describe chemo fog, this problems with memory. A lesion to the hippocampus results in impaired development of long-term memory because we cannot consolidate our information. It'll also it'll also cause a failure to link memories with sense of familiarity. So you've probably heard of déjà vu, that feeling of knowing a place even though you've not been there before, or of an experience even though you know this is your first time experiencing it, but it just seems so familiar. Jamais vu is a feeling of not knowing someplace that you know you've been to before. So it should be something that you've experienced, but it just does not seem to be at all familiar. That is jamais vu. So failing to link a memory along with the appropriate feeling of familiarity is something that will happen with damage to the hippocampus. The amygdala is an almond-shaped nucleus. So you know that it's going to be cell bodies and dendrites. And it's located at the tip of the tail of a structure called the caudate nucleus. The caudate nucleus is part of our basal ganglia, and we'll be talking about that in the next lecture. But the caudate nucleus has a large head, a large nucleus, if you will, and then this long tail that makes a C shape, kind of very similar to the way the lateral ventricles make a C shape. And at the tip of the tail, you have this nucleus known as the amygdala. The amygdala is important for assessing risks at all time. So it's constantly assessing us for if we're at risk for some type of insult. It sets off cascades of responses to threats and distresses. It is particularly associated with strong negative emotions such as fear and anger. And fear seems to be kind of a unique feature for the amygdala. It's very much associated with this sense of fear. It's considered to be a salience detector. So salience is how important something is to you. So there may be something that's very important to me, but not at all important to you. So that it has a different salience for the two of us. And the amygdala looks at what's going on around us and what's going on within us and determines if it's something that is salient to us or not. It evaluates threat signals and emotional and social clues. So again, it's taking what's going on within us and outside of us and determining how salient it is and our response to it. It's very important in emotional learning and memory. So a very strong emotional type of incident is readily embedded into long-term memory by the amygdala and connecting back to the hippocampus. It's important in the development of these implicit, means within, emotional memories. And these emotional memories are much more indelible than non-emotional memories. So when you're thinking about learning facts and figures, whether it's facts about what all these different structures do, whether it's facts about dates and history, whatever, those kinds of things, you can tell that, they don't necessarily stick around if you don't use them. Do you remember a specific date in history for a particular battle that you had to know in elementary or middle or high school? Likelihood is you may not, unless it had a lot of meaning to you. But these emotional memories, something that's very traumatic, very happy, birth of a child, weddings, or an attack, people who suffer from physical assaults, wartime incidents, things like that. These memories can be very difficult to eradicate. And they can be formed with only one incident. So a particular battle incident in war, you only have to be attacked the one time. Your child is only going to be born one time. You may have multiple births, but each one will have its own emotional memory associated with it. So it can be single trial learning. For most learning, as we'll talk about at the end of the unit, you need repetition, and this goes back to what we talked about with long-term potentiation. But if it's a very strong emotional type of situation, it can result in rapid changes that take place, leading to more long-term potentiation under a single trial. Here's an idea of how sensory information going through the amygdala can activate a stress response. You have sensory information, which other than the sense of smell is going to go through the thalamus, but it's also then going to go to the amygdala in addition to the primary sensory cortices. The amygdala integrates the different information, determines the salience, and determines the threat potential of the incoming senses. And if there is a threat potential, it sends input to the hypothalamus, which then activates our autonomic nervous system and the pituitary gland. So we get the release of stress hormones from the pituitary gland, which also then activates the adrenal medulla and cortisol, and it activates the autonomic nervous system, so our heart rate goes up, we might start sweating, etc. Here you can see my representation of the position of this particular nucleus, the amygdala. Lesions of the amygdala can lead to either overactivity or underactivity. So if it's damage to the amygdala itself, we're going to get underactivity. But there can be tumors or other conditions that can create overactivity of the amygdala. You can also have injury to structures that would normally inhibit the amygdala, resulting in disinhibition. Overactivity of the amygdala results in night terrors, panic attacks, and is associated with PTSD. Underactivity of the amygdala is associated with psychopathy, otherwise known as antisocial personality disorder. People will tend to demonstrate personalities that are cold. They may be bullies. They may be deceitful, and they lack a sense of remorse. You might also find risk-taking behaviors because the amygdala seems to be so important in the sense of fear that if you have damage to the amygdala, that you may diminish or even lose that sense of fear. There's a case of a woman who had damage to bilateral amygdala, and she had no sense of fear at all. So she would put herself in situations that were highly risk-taking. Such as going into places of high crime areas and all times of the evening and not thinking anything of it because she had no fear. in addition to other more physically threatening kinds of situations. And again, no sense of fear. So she would just go right into the situation, not even thinking twice. So risk-taking behavior is related to lack of fear, but also the inability to recognize fear in others, whether it's facial expression or whether it's body language, but not recognizing specifically that expression of fear that others may be showing. Now I want to talk about two deep cortical regions that are not associated with a particular lobe. They cross lobes, and they're located either deeply within the lateral sulcus or deeply within the longitudinal fissure. And these are the insula and the cingulate cortex. The insula is located deep in the sylvian fissure, which is the lateral fissure. The insula has extremely complex connections. Think of the insula, though, as being responsible for balancing the external environment and our internal environment. It also is very important in integrating a variety of different aspects of pain. So you'll recall that pain has a discriminative sensory aspect, an affective behavioral aspect or motivational aspect, and then it's also got a cognitive aspect. And the insula seems to be an area that takes those different dimensions and helps to integrate them together to give the person their overall pain experience. Lesion of the insula can lead to a variety of different effects depending on what portion of the insula is damaged. The only one that I'm going to really ask you to know, well, there's two of them, and I'm going to kind of ask you to think about. One is that in the right insula, damage seems to be associated with a condition known as anosognosia. Anosognosia is denial of illness or unawareness of illness. So someone may have little use of a limb, but they don't recognize that they can't use that limb normally. I'm trying to recall if your book gave this example or if it's from someplace else, but of a gentleman who had this condition, and when his doctor asked him about his ability to climb a ladder, I don't remember if it was an upper extremity, lower extremity, or both extremities, so a hemiplegia, but the individual indicated he'd have no trouble. But when the physician asked him if the physician were the one that had difficulty with the arm or leg or both, would he have a problem climbing a ladder? And the patient said, well, certainly. So the patient did not recognize his own limitations, the fact that he did have some impairments. And so it's this denial of an illness or an injury to self. Another thing that can be associated with the insula is feelings of disgust. And this may be why it's associated with anorexia nervosa, along with areas involved with body image, such as the secondary somatosensory cortex and the parieto-temporal association area. The cingulate gyrus is a long gyrus that lies over the top of the corpus callosum. The anterior aspect, so the anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC, is located in the frontal lobe, while the posterior aspect is located in the parietal lobe. The anterior aspect appears to be important in connecting emotion to thought. So this is like our connector between the temporal lobe, limbic areas, and the frontal lobe, both the limbic areas and the more lateral cognitive areas. It is very much important in the suppression of pain, so our inherent ability to suppress pain. And it's also involved in placebos. The posterior aspect of the parietal lobe connects perceptions to thought. So this is again connecting the frontal lobe, which is more of our cognitive brain area, with the parietal lobe, where all of these sensations seem to come in and get integrated and that parieto-temporal association area. The cingulate gyrus is important in attention and sustained concentration. So you might recall that the parieto-temporal association area, particularly in the right hemisphere, is important in our selectively attending to things in our environment, as well as the ability to shift attention. It sends the information on these areas of the environment to the cingulate cortex and to the prefrontal cortex to help, and those areas then help us to maintain the attention. And so sustaining concentration and maintaining attention are important for, functions of the cingulate gyrus. And it also helps, like the parieto-temporal association area, to help filter out irrelevant stimuli. The cingulate gyrus is important in prioritizing relevance of items to help us determine goal-directed behavior. And it's involved with emotional processing and development of empathy and affection and attachment to another. The cingulate gyrus is also involved with the detection of errors and conflict resolution. The Stroop task is a rather famous task. It was developed by a graduate student in psychology. And you can go to the link here to get the instructions on how to do the task and how it works. But in essence, what you have here are words for colors, the names of colors, but the ink used is a color that is not the same color as the word. So for instance, the word blue is in red ink. The word green is in blue ink, etc. And the idea with the task is to read as quickly as you can the colors of the ink and not the word itself. So we have a conflict. We have a conflict because the color of the ink and the word itself do not match. And the cingulate gyrus is the part that allows us to detect this fact that it doesn't match and hopefully to make the correct choice in saying the word that is being asked of you. And here in the little pink dots, you can see the cingulate gyrus. So the front part of it, the anterior cingulate cortex being in the frontal lobe, and the posterior aspect of it being in the parietal lobe. Lesions of the cingulate gyrus tend to lead to indecisiveness, also leading to, when decisions are made, they're made rationally without any emotional input. That might sound good at the beginning, but if you choose just rationally, that can lead to some not so pleasant effects. For instance, maybe you choose a job because this job offers you $2,000 a year more than the other job. But you fit in much better with the job that was slightly less in pay. You like the people there better. But you ignore all of that emotional component. Or maybe one job is close to family, the one that pays a little bit less, but the other one, is much farther away from family, and you're very close to your family, and you like to visit and socialize with your family. But you don't take any of that into account. You just look at the fact that this one pays me $2,000 a year more than this one, so that's the one I'm going to take. So rational decisions with no emotional input don't always lead to a good outcome. A person will frequently be associated with a loss of empathy if this area is damaged. Their thinking can become very rigid, and they can be obsessed with minor details. They can't let it go. They may become apathetic and socially withdrawal. There may be difficulty in concentrating because, again, they can't maintain that attention. They can direct the attention to a particular thing, but they can't seem to maintain that attention. Their ability to experience pleasure may be affected. and they may have more difficulty with controlling pain, so they may have more pain complaints and reports. And if the anterior cingulate gyrus is affected, they may have difficulty with amnesia, and we'll talk about anterograde versus retrograde amnesia when we talk about memory at the end of the unit. And finally, we have just kind of a big overall summary picture. You will notice that it does not exactly match mine, and some of the labels are slightly different, but just getting this general overall big picture is what I want you to get from this. A couple of things I might point out is that in this particular image, the artist combined the SMA with the premotor cortex and made it just one big area. Also, the primary visual cortex is shown in a much broader area than you would really have it on the lateral aspect. But for the most part, I mean, it looks very similar to what I have, and it gives you that big picture that I want you to know of where these different things are generally located.